for each. Hmm. Good boy, Ron. This week I want to start. This week I want to start with a question. Why do people believe in conspiracy theories? After all, many conspiracy theories are built on nothing but hearsay, inaccurate reporting, and circumstantial evidence. But despite this, obviously, many of us find these cases to be endlessly fascinating. Perhaps one of the reasons is that we suspect that there's a deeper, darker side to history, and we want to know the truth behind it. And when the truth slips through, we're reminded of all the things going on outside of our
Good night. Don't talk to me. Bye. Just kidding. Talk to me if you want.
MK Ultra. The story of MK Ultra is one of secrecy, torture, spies, and illegal science experiments of mind control and murder.
I'm right now though, so can't really help you out too much.
We call this story a conspiracy theory. We don't have to guess what the government was doing. They've told us themselves. For over 20 years, the CIA experimented on and even tortured Americans without their consent, all in the name of finding a means of mind control. The program was called MK Ultra and will forever stand as the ultimate evidence that at any time the government could be lying to you. And if you're lucky, that's the worst they'll do to you. As always, everybody, if you want to see the references that I used to construct this episode, there is a resources document in the show description. All parties are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. I don't want to go anywhere and do anything to myself or disappear, if that makes sense. And all opinions presented on today's show are solely mine, Colin Brown, host and producer of The Conspiracy Files. This is actually the start of a two-part series on MK Ultra that we're doing here. But yeah, it's time to do a deep dive. So obviously, as you may know here on the show for the last month and a half, we've been covering Epstein almost exclusively. That's because it's a story that's close to my heart. I know some of the survivors. It's the most important story of the modern age, one of the most important stories in United States history, political history, and just world history. And I've been trying to raise the alarm about Epstein for years now, and it's working to a degree. People are learning, people are upset, people are angry, they're making their voices heard, and we're seeing the tides turn a little bit. Now, Pam Bondi is saying that they're going to have the files released soon, but to me, I mean, files matter in a way because it's like pulling the curtain back a little bit on the operation. And hopefully, there are some things that they missed that they rush to redact and don't redact. And there are definitely things in these files that make people look extremely guilty. However, it doesn't really matter unless there are prosecutions. It doesn't matter if nobody goes down for this. It doesn't matter if they don't actually end up investigating Epstein or the ring. So yeah, it's been my obsession, as you guys know. I'm sorry that almost every episode has been about the Epstein scandal. We're gonna do some regular programming for a little bit, and I'm gonna pepper the Epstein episodes within those. But today's story is one I've wanted to tell for a very long time, and it's about time we tackle the big dog, the elephant in the room, MK Ultra, one of the most evil things the U.S. government ever did, and its extensions. It extends into a lot of these predator rings that we talk about here on the show. These studies extend into mind control and breaking down children through, well, I'll just say enough for the end. Oh yeah, and please, if you're watching the show on YouTube, be sure to leave me a comment. Let me know your thoughts on this story. Make sure to like the video and share this video on your social media, whether it's a story of you watching the episode on Instagram. Please tag me at the Paranormal Files. That's my main account. Or you make a TikTok video. I'd love to see some people make some TikTok videos shouting out the show. That would be really cool if you guys could do something like that. It just helps grow because obviously this channel has been a battle since day one. So anything that you guys can do to help, helps so much. And if you're listening to the show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, hello to everybody over there. Please be sure to leave me a 5-star review wherever you're listening to this podcast, because there are some people who believe in partisan hack and they review bomb me. So, yeah, if you guys could just show some love on there, it'd be really appreciated. But let's go back to the beginning. To really understand MK Ultra, we have to turn back the clock to the first few decades of the 20th century. It's a time of staggering change, both positive and negative. For all the wonderful inventions that came out of that time period, like light bulbs and radios and faster, sleeker cars, there were some devastating developments too, like new and improved weapons. The First World War had shown humanity destruction at a level it had never seen before. And by the 1940s, that same devastation was coming back again in the form of yet another world war. And this time, the horrors will be amplified by the development of atomic weapons. With Axis powers like Nazi Germany sweeping across Europe and the future of world history at stake, the United States and its allies were willing to do just about anything to win the war. So, to stay one step ahead of the enemy, the United States government formed the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, in 1942. The OSS became the nation's first intelligence service, and even today, echoes of that group are still felt across global politics. But back in 1942, the OSS was a group of dedicated officers doing anything they could, legal or not, to try and bring World War II to a close and obviously to ensure an American Allied victory. At its height, the OSS had nearly 13,000 agents, all of whom kept their positions totally secret, and these weren't pencil-pushing analysts. The OSS emphasized real-world missions, and with an essentially unlimited budget and practically no oversight whatsoever, sometimes that meant that things got a little sticky. For example, at one point, OSS officers broke into a Japanese embassy in Portugal, made off with a Japanese codebook, which they hoped could be used to decipher messages containing key intelligence. At first, the mission seemed like a huge success, but because the OSS didn't communicate with other agencies or the military, they didn't know that the code had already been broken by the US, rendering the stolen book completely useless. When the Japanese discovered the book missing from the embassy, they changed their code, which then negated all the time and money that the US had spent cracking the code to begin with. In the end, this was a massive waste in time for all of the agents involved, and obviously the soldiers and people that weren't in the OSS that worked their ass off to crack that code. On top of mix-ups like that, the OSS also had problems with theft and corruption. These were super secret agents working with unlimited cash on clandestine projects. Sometimes that money made its way into the hands of OSS agents instead of the projects that it belonged to. All of this isn't to say the OSS didn't play a critical role in ending World War II. It certainly did, but we can't tell the story of MK Ultra without diving into the murky world of the OSS, and this very next bit is why. You see, along with missions like the one in the Japanese embassy, the OSS was also interested in science and technology. In particular, OSS leadership wanted to develop a new truth serum drug. This mission became of utmost importance to the OSS, who hoped that such a drug could be used to interrogate prisoners or root out spies. The farthest OSS scientists ever got to a truth serum was experimenting with marijuana, which ultimately, obviously, didn't help them. They found, as many modern-day marijuana users can attest to, that while the drug did make some of the test subjects talkative, it made others nervous, paranoid, and confused. While OSS agents did have a good time dosing each other with marijuana tinctures and cigarettes to see what the effect would be, aside from making a few people sick and some others giddy, they didn't come any closer to cracking open the secret to a truth serum. Soon after that, the head of OSS Research and Development, Stanley Lovell, had a new thought. He wanted to know if hypnosis could be used to make a German soldier not only hate Hitler, but to convince him to members of the Gestapo. Essentially, he was wondering about the possibility of mind control. In the end, none of the OSS drug or hypnosis trials led to any results. Well, at least that's as far as we know. But that doesn't mean that they didn't have a very big impact. You see, after the end of World War II, the Americans realized that they had traded one conflict for another, and its Cold War with Russia continued to intensify, especially with the new threat of nuclear weapons. So, while the OSS was officially on paper disbanded after World War II, a new intelligence organization was born from its ashes, the CIA. Now, I do want to state before we move on, investigative journalist Whitney Webb, in her book One Nation Under Blackmail, traces the origin of the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. And really, what we should be calling it's not really a scandal, it's an operation. He was an agent, a cog in a dark, twisted machine. She traces his origins through the players and the power brokers and the people, all the way back not only to the OSS. There were a lot of people involved with the OSS who would go on to birth the Epstein operation, but she goes all the way back to organized crime in the United States and bootleggers and prohibition. It's very, very interesting to see some of these powerful families and these powerful people that worked within the OSS and these associated agencies, collaborating with intelligence agents and dignitaries from foreign countries and working in this dark, malignant apparatus, this intelligence apparatus that would eventually give birth to Epstein. So the OSS definitely had some unintended side effects that came out of it, some pure evil stuff, including obviously MK Ultra. But we're talking about the CIA. Begun in 1947, this new agency, the CIA, would continue much of the work that the OSS had done and would employ many of its original agents. As the CIA began to go through old OSS files, they found details on the truth serum and hypnosis experiments that had taken place during the 1940s. These files would go on to lay much of the groundwork for what would eventually become MK Ultra. Since the Cold War was defined by an intense need to know what technology the other side had and how to top them, when the CIA became convinced the Soviets were developing mind control techniques, they were determined to get there first. The CIA experimented for a short time with a number of smaller projects like Operation Bluebird and Operation Artichoke. These early trials featured many of the elements that would later define MK Ultra experiments: secrecy, illicit drugs, unwilling victims, and virtually zero oversight. Through Bluebird and Artichoke, the CIA was trying to answer 5 key questions. 1. Could accurate information be obtained through? 2. Could guarantee total amnesia? 3. Could make someone change their personality, and how permanent could that change be? 4. Could unwilling subjects be made into willing agents? And 5. How quickly could all of this be done? By 1953, the operation had fully morphed into MK Ultra, an immense program that included over 150 sub-projects and 80 different institutions, including universities, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies. Much of the time, MK Ultra acted as a funder of research, seeking out scientists who were already conducting the types of experiments the CIA was interested in, and they would then provide them with money to continue said experiments. In internal memos, the CIA wrote it was looking to fund, quote, research and development of chemical, biological, and radioactive materials and of techniques for the employment of electroshock capable of producing human behavioral or physiological change. End quote. Oftentimes, those who received funding had no idea that their work was being paid for by the CIA, which, let me remind you, is funded by American tax dollars. That's because the CIA sent the money through a front organization, basically a fake group that they were hiding behind called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. Through this front, this fake group, the CIA would send mind-boggling amounts of money to researchers all across the world involved in a wide range of bizarre and often inhumane projects. And the man in charge of all this was CIA scientist Sidney Gottlieb. And Gottlieb was a man of many interests. In addition to being somewhat of a mad scientist, kind of a dude straight out of a science fiction movie, he also raised goats, wrote poetry, and lived in an isolated lodge that only had outdoor toilets. Gottlieb began his career in the FDA before moving to the CIA, where he became chief of the chemical division of the technical services staff. And it was while he was serving in this position that Gottlieb was secretly chosen to run MK Ultra. Journalist Stephen Kinzer spent years researching both MK Ultra and the man who led the program, and his book, Poisoner in Chief, is filled with shocking insights about Gottlieb and the CIA. In his role as head agent of the top secret program, Gottlieb was virtually unmonitored. Kinzer writes in his book, quote, this guy had a license to kill. He was allowed to requisition human subjects across the United States and around the world and subject them to any kind of abuse that he wanted, even up to the level of being fatal. Yet nobody looked over his shoulder. He never had to file serious reports to anybody. I think the mentality must have been that this project is so important. Mind control, if it can be mastered, is the key to global world power. End quote. And things get so much darker from there. As we mentioned before, the CIA took a lot of inspiration from early OSS truth serum experiments, but that wasn't the only place it looked for insight. After the end of World War II, the Americans began rounding up surviving Nazi scientists and recruiting them to work for the US government. This project, as you may know, was known as Operation Paperclip. One of the recruited scientists was a man named Walter Schreiber, who had been the Surgeon General for the Nazi Army. Schreiber had been the man to approve of the experiments conducting in Auschwitz and Dachau, where people were frozen, injected with chemicals, and cut open so gangrene on their bones while they were alive could be monitored. He was absolutely a murderer, a war criminal, and a die-hard Nazi. But still, he was essentially forgiven by the United States government and brought in by the CIA to assist with the early projects that would become MK Ultra. Now, alongside CIA scientists, this Nazi scientist, Schreiber, would conduct experiments on inmates in a secret CIA prison in Germany. There, in the dingy old dark basement of an abandoned estate, POWs and other enemies of the US government were subjected to illegal experimentation. And eventually, those smaller projects would morph into MK Ultra, which would operate for 20 years before it was finally shuttered and the majority of its documents were destroyed. To this day, 2026, not one individual involved in this program has ever been held accountable for the countless lives that were forever ruined and even ended in the CIA's pursuit of mind control. Now, as we mentioned earlier, MK Ultra sought out scientists doing research to provide them secret funding. Perhaps the most sinister scientist of them all was Dr. Ewan Cameron. Cameron was a Scottish psychiatrist working at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Canada. There, at that institute, he was determined to develop a method of treatment that could cure nearly any form of mental illness in just a single session or two. Cameron was obsessed with this task and was willing to do whatever it took to earn himself the Nobel Peace Prize. By the time the CIA sniffed him out, Cameron was working as a senior member of staff at the Allen Memorial Institute, which at the time was actually considered to be a progressive place. You see, unlike other psychiatric hospitals at the time, the Allen operated with an open door policy, meaning that patients could make the decision to leave the facility at any time if they so wished. This was in contrast to the history of most psychiatric institutions up to this point, which more often than not resembled prisons, where your stay could be not only miserable, but also indefinite. I mean, we know the history of psychiatric treatments and these asylums in America. I've investigated a bunch of them on my channel, The Paranormal Files. You're talking antiquated torture techniques, essentially, that were done to these people, bizarre methods to try cure illness. We're talking about sterilization, eugenics programs, rampant abuse in these facilities, rampant abuse. And I'm talking physical, and oftentimes it was employees, the patients, those who couldn't speak for themselves. They were just absolute places of horror. So when you look at this place, the Allen, where people could leave at any time, it seemed progressive and forward thinking. And the Allen also functioned as a day hospital, allowing patients to come in to receive treatment and then head home in the evening. No overnight stay necessary. Today, obviously, both of these practices are standard for many psychiatric institutions, but at the time that Allen began to implement them, they were brand new. And just like its modern policies, it seemed that the Allen had a hospital director to match, the aforementioned Dr. Ewan Cameron. At first glance, Cameron seemed to be the cream of the crop. He was well respected by his peers and was known for his progressive and humane treatments for those suffering from mental ailments. It seemed only natural that he would become director at the Allen, where he attempted to bring this facility into the modern day in a way that a lot of other institutions were not seeing at the time. But Dr. Ewan Cameron was far more complicated than that. While some people saw the energetic, world renowned psychiatrist, others saw a much darker side. One former colleague of Cameron's, a Dr. Elliot Emanuel, had this to say, quote, "He was an authoritarian, ruthless, power hungry, tense, angry, not very nice." And Dr. Ewan Cameron also had unusual and controversial opinions at the time about the mentally ill. He viewed mental illness as a literal contagion, a disease of sorts, kind of like, I don't know, the flu, something that could be passed from one person to another, meaning that those who suffered from it should be absolutely quarantined and fully separated from the population. In some cases, Cameron's views entered the territory of racism and xenophobia. He wrote at length, for example, on what should be done to the German people in the wake of World War II. He said, quote, "Get it understood how dangerous these damaged, sick personalities are to ourselves, and above all to our children, whose traits are taking form, and we shall find ways to put an end to them." End quote. Cameron is speaking here not only about Germans, but of anyone who shows the traits of possessiveness, insecurity, and jealousy, all of which he viewed as being contagions to the human race. But it would be Cameron's work with LSD and memory tampering that would garner the CIA's interest in him. By the time that he received MK Ultra funding, Cameron had already been conducting the brutal experiments we're about to describe for years. Documents show that Cameron was paid $69,000 by the CIA, roughly $600,000 in today's money, for his efforts in studying mind control. So, what exactly was it that Dr. Cameron was doing for the CIA, and what was the nature of his work at the Allen Hospital? Well, on the surface, Cameron was a dedicated clinician seeking new forms of treatment for schizophrenia. Keep in mind that at the time, schizophrenia was a term used to classify any number of mental illnesses, including bipolar and depression. But in an old staple outside the main hospital, Cameron was up to something far more nefarious. You see, Cameron believed that a cure to schizophrenia might lie in what he called depatterning, a process in which a patient's memory was erased and they entered a more childlike state. From the depatterned state, the patient's personality, according to his theory, could then be rebuilt brick by brick. This form of treatment was, to say the least, at the time, highly experimental. It was also exactly the sort of thing Sidney Gottlieb was looking for in his research. Kinzer, the author of that book about all of these things, writes, quote, "Gottlieb wanted to create a way to seize control of people's minds, and he realized it was a two-part process. First, you had to blast away the existing mind. Second, you had to find a way to insert a new mind into that resulting void. We didn't get too far on number two, but he did a lot of work on number one." And while Dr. Ewan Cameron's work was ostensibly meant to be conducted on schizophrenic patients, it seems that he was willing to use almost anyone who showed up to the Allen Hospital, no matter their diagnosis. In the decades since, many have come out to share more about the horrors that they and their loved ones endured at the Allen. Typical MK Ultra experiments at the Allen went like this. To begin the process of depatterning, as he called it, Cameron's patients would be put into an insulin-induced coma. Patients would routinely be kept in these comas for weeks at a time, for 20 hours a day. Patients would be forced to listen to tapes in their rooms and repeat the same messages over and over. The messages like, "Stop it, it makes me weak," and "it is the truth," were intended to reprogram the subject's personality. Patients would also be subjected to long, numerous, and intense sessions of electroshock therapy. These massive doses of electric shock were often 20 times more powerful than standard shock treatment. While it sounds brutal, electric shock therapy has actually been used to treat severe depression for decades, always under anesthesia and with a trained team to monitor. But Cameron's method was more akin to a horror movie than what responsible shock therapy looks like. Not only would the bouts be more intense, but they would be far more often. While a typical patient might get routine shock therapy a few times a week, those under Cameron's care received it as many as 3 times a day. And this would go on for weeks at a time. Combined, the comas and shock treatment did indeed successfully break people's minds. In Dr. Emmanuel's words, the process would reduce the patient to a quote, sort of animal vegetable state. And in Cameron's own words, the patient would, quote, "be unable to walk without support, to feed himself, and he may show double incontinence. He lives, as it were, in a very narrow segment of time and space. He cannot well record what is going on around him. He cannot retrieve data from the past." And if Cameron and his doctors didn't feel that the patient had been successfully depatterned, the process would then begin anew. The entire treatment pattern, the insulin-induced coma, the shock therapy, the repeating for 20 hours a day, the phrases and words, that would all begin again. Dr. Ewan Cameron was correct in thinking that he could remove memories and personality traits through depatterning, but the results were crude and absolutely inhumane. Patients would often forget their toilet training, the names of their own families, and lost sense of themselves altogether. They emerged from the Allen Hospital lost, afraid, and angry with no understanding as to why. In one case, doctors at the Allen were disappointed to hear that after 27 days, one patient was still expressing a connection to his former life by asking to see his wife. But what was their solution to this problem? More shock therapy and another 30 days of an insulin coma. The patient, Charles Tanney, had been sent to the Allen Hospital, as it turns out, for jaw pain. Nothing mental, nothing wrong with their brain, for simple jaw pain. He had no idea that he would be used as a CIA test subject, and he never consented to being experimented upon. His daughter, Julie Tanny, reports that after leaving the Allen, her father was forever changed and broken. Once the doting, loving father, Charles soon began the daughter he used to be so close with. Quote, he didn't know me or my two siblings. He remembered my mother, but he didn't remember he had children or that he had a business or anything, and he was very detached. That never changed. He never came back to the person he was before. End quote. Charles Tanny's story is just one of many. Lena Sowchuk, the daughter of another one of Dr. Ewan Cameron's patients, reported similar things about her own father. Quote, he never came out the same. He had a blank look in his eye. He didn't know who we were. He didn't know we were his daughters. He lost his job. We went into poverty after he came out. End quote. But Dr. Ewan Cameron also had no qualms about experimenting on minors. Lena Ponting was just 16 years old when she was sent to the Allen Hospital. Like many teenagers, she was having trouble at home. If she had been sent to another facility, perhaps she could have received the counseling and support she needed to deal with the challenges of growing up. Instead, Lena was sent to the Allen, where she was soon in care with Dr. Ewan Cameron. Like the adults around her, Lena was dosed with LSD without her or her parents' consent. Lena reports that she and the other children at the Allen were given LSD in their Kool-Aid. After her release, Lena was also changed forever. Quote, there was a lot I could not remember after I got out of the Allen. When my family came, I was a zombie. I didn't even know who they were. End quote. And Lena's story gets even darker. Quote, I was drugged up so bad I can't remember half of what they did to me. I bore a son when I was at the Allen Memorial, and I got pregnant without ever knowing who the father was. End quote. Now, you'll notice that we just mentioned LSD. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, let me just spell it out. I've got a little Google AI overview here. LSD, or lysergic acid diethylamide, is a powerful semi-synthetic hallucinogenic drug derived from ergot, a fungus that grows on rye. Known as acid, LSD induces intense psychological effects by acting as a serotonin receptor agonist. It is a controlled substance popular in 1960s counterculture for its mind-altering properties, which can include vivid sensory distortions and altered consciousness. The use of LSD was common in MK Ultra studies, as the CIA had quickly identified it as being a drug that had the potential to unlock the power of mind control. Like many of the other doctors involved in MK Ultra, Cameron was also interested in the potential uses for LSD, what often do his patients and then leave them unattended. This was a dangerous case of neglect, as it left patients who would often suffer from terrifying and hyper-realistic hallucinations to deal with these things all on their own. When he was just 18 years old, Bob Logie was sent to the Allen Hospital for his severe leg pain, which had been diagnosed as psychosomatic. It wasn't until years later, when reports on MK Ultra experiments at the Allen emerged, that Bob requested the medical records from his time there. And he was then absolutely shocked to see that he had been dosed with LSD during his treatment, something he says he never consented to. Quote, I feel like I've been completely used. I feel like my mind has been invaded. I suppose if guinea pigs have feelings, they feel like I do. And beyond the breach of medical ethics committed by not getting consent, there were other reasons that LSD was a controversial treatment plan. While most of us today are well aware that LSD or acid is a hallucinogenic drug, and some have even used it recreationally, totally not me ever. Wink. At the time MK Ultra began, the general public knew almost nothing about the drug or its impact. Someone like Bob, who was dosed without his knowledge, would have had no understanding of the visions he was seeing or what would happen to him, making the experience that much more terrifying. It wasn't until Bob obtained his medical records that he understood much of what had happened to him at the Allen. Quote, the LSD was really horrifying. They gave it to me about 12 or 15 times. One minute I would see the doctor there, and then the next minute I wouldn't see him there. They were asking me all kinds of questions. I remember them telling me I was getting smaller and smaller, and I really felt myself getting smaller. They were bringing me back in time. At one point, I felt like I was just about to be born. They were really probing and asking all kinds of questions, and I felt I didn't have any control. I had to answer. It felt like they had complete control over me. End quote. While Bob's leg pains eventually did resolve after a treatment of cortisol, the effects of the LSD continued to trouble him. Soon enough, Bob was back at the Allen Hospital, this time getting treatment for mental problems that had developed, unbeknownst to him, as a result of his LSD dosage. Quote, I was having a hard time. I couldn't hold down a job for very long. I was going from one place to another, and the anxiety really built up, and I just couldn't cope. End quote. Eventually, Bob was desperate to leave the island. He tried several times to run away, but each time was caught and returned to the hospital, where he was subjected to the deep patterning and psychic driving treatments Cameron was so fond of. When Bob was eventually released, he was given no explanation or compensation for his participation in the experiments. Like the others, he had to simply try and move on with his life. For decades, no one who endured Cameron's trials knew what had happened to them, and they definitely didn't know it had anything to do with the American government. It wasn't until the public learned about MK Ultra in the 1970s that the truth about the Allen Hospital emerged. 7 years later, after the experiments, victims' families are still fighting for justice. But the Allen Hospital was far from the only place where the CIA was taking advantage of unknowing civilians. So now let's take a look at a few more of the dozens of projects that existed under the banner of MK Ultra, beginning with Operation Midnight Climax. As you may have gleaned from the name, this top secret project involved the CIA wanted to know what unsuspecting people would do if they were laced with LSD, so they established safe houses in San Francisco and New York City. After the safe house was set up, who were on the CIA's payroll would lure clients back to the safe houses where they would secretly be given, most commonly, LSD. After sleeping with the clients, the will ask questions and even attempt to feed them subliminal messages. Clients were instructed to commit robbery, assault, and even murder. And the entire time that this was happening, CIA agents would be watching on the other side of the room through a two-way mirror. And when they weren't observing those experiments, which is creepy in itself, they were watching these random, completely obviously non-consenting people having, first of all, they were just watching them have, and then they were also dosing these people who had no idea with hallucinogenic drugs and then trying to brainwash them into committing crimes, which was just crazy. But when the CIA agents weren't observing those experiments, it wasn't uncommon for them to indulge in the at the safe house. And if you're wondering where the CIA got all the LSD they used from, the answer is simple. In the early 1950s, Sidney Gottlieb, the guy, basically in charge of MK Ultra, spent $240,000 and purchased the world's entire supply of LSD, which he then had brought over to America. From there, the drug was used by CIA scientists and provided to hospitals, prisons, and academic institutions around the United States. In fact, you may be surprised to hear some of the colleges who received funding from the CIA for MK Ultra research. They included Cornell University, George Washington University, Harvard University, Princeton University, Stanford University, the University of Illinois, the University of Maryland, the University of Minnesota, the University of Pennsylvania, and the University of Texas, which is actually where I went to school. And that's just to name a few. But back to that LSD. Pretty early on, Sidney Gottlieb knew that even if it and other drugs proved to be useful, CIA agents would have to get good at dosing people without them knowing. So, to teach agents the sleight of hand necessary to spike people with illicit, the CIA hired John Mulholland, a world famous magician. Mulholland agreed, and in turn for $3,000, he wrote a spy manual that, amongst other things, taught the reader, quote, to develop the skills to surreptitiously place a pill or other substance in drink or food to be consumed by a target. End quote. This manual, called the Official CIA Manual of Trickery and Deception, was unknown by the general public until it was accidentally discovered in 2007. The book is now easily available online to all those who wish to learn more about the art of spycraft. While this magical MK Ultra project sounds a bit sillier than the rest, it was just as dangerous though as the others. In fact, it would be the secret dosing of drugs that Mulholland taught that would lead to at least one untimely death, and that is the death of Frank Olson. On Saturday, November 28th, 1953, the 2 a.m. quiet was suddenly broken when a man fell from a 10th story hotel room and met the New York City street below. Thinking he had just seen a self-unaliving attempt, the hotel manager rushed outside where the victim, Frank Olson, was lying in a pool of his own blood in nothing but his underwear. Around him, the street was covered in broken glass and a growing pool of his blood. Thinking quick and looking up towards the sky, the manager of the hotel saw the curtains of Olson's room, which were billowing outwards in the open air. As Olson endured his final agonizing moments, he tried desperately to say something to the manager. There was too much blood in his throat for him to be understood. He died on the scene, leaving his final message that he was trying to whisper to that manager a complete mystery. After police arrived, they went directly to Olson's hotel room, 1018A, where they found Robert Lashbrook, the man he'd been staying with. Lashbrook, when officers arrived, was sitting on the toilet with his head in his hands. He told police that he'd been asleep when Olson had jumped and had woken up to the sound of his roommate smashing through the glass before falling to the ground below. Almost obviously at once, the circumstances of Olson's death seemed suspicious. The hotel manager himself was even quoted as saying, quote, "In all my years in the hotel business, I never encountered a case where someone got up in the middle of the night, ran across a dark room in his underwear, avoiding two beds, and dove through a closed window with the shade and curtains drawn." End quote. And police thought the story was strange too. While on the scene, they even remarked that the death seemed eerily similar to that of Lawrence Duggan, who died in 1948, 10 days after being interrogated by the FBI about his connections to the Soviets. Duggan had also reportedly self-unalived by throwing himself from a tall building in New York City. And there was indeed some evidence that Olson's death had not been an accident. That night, the hotel's operator had connected a call from 1018A to a number listed as the contact for a Dr. Harold Abramson. According to the operator who overheard the brief conversation, command from the hotel room told Abramson, "Well, he's gone." Abramson then replied over the phone, "Well, that's too bad." It doesn't take a seasoned detective to make the assumption that that may have well been Robert Lashbrook alerting a co-conspirator that he had successfully murdered Olson by shoving him out of a 10th floor hotel window. But what reason would Lashbrook have to kill Olson, and how does any of this relate to MK Ultra? Well, the answer is simple. Robert Lashbrook was second in command to Sidney Gottlieb, the man running MK Ultra, and Frank Olson himself was a government scientist. Can't make this up. Now, Olson's death was eventually ruled to be either a self-unaliving or an accident, and that was the story his family stuck with for decades. However, as the years passed, Frank Olson's son, Eric, began to wonder more about what happened in that hotel room, as well as what his father had actually done for a living. All Frank's wife, Alice, had ever told the children was that he had done important research for the government, but that he was unhappy with his job. Shortly before he died, Frank even told his wife that he believed he had made a huge mistake, though he never elaborated on what that mistake was. It wasn't until 20 years after his death that the Olsons finally got more answers, though it's tough to say if those answers brought any comfort to them. In 1975, documents from the Rockefeller Commission, which investigated the illegal activities of the CIA, revealed the story of the wrongful death of a government scientist. According to the report, the scientist had been dosed with LSD without his knowledge as part of a CIA experiment. After experiencing side effects, the scientist was sent to New York to undergo a psychological evaluation, and shortly afterwards, from a 10th floor window to his death. The report on the death of that scientist made its way to the newspapers and then eventually to the Olson family themselves. And shortly afterwards, they learned that Frank Olson was indeed the scientist who had been in the report. The Olson family was invited to the White House, where they then received a formal apology from President Gerald Ford himself for the wrongful death of Frank Olson. The family also accepted a $700,000 settlement in exchange for not suing the government. But despite getting more answers about what may have led up to Frank Olson's death, Olson's kids still didn't understand what had happened. What had made Frank Olson special enough to warrant an apology from the President of the United States? When and how had he been dosed by CIA agents, and to what end? With the story now making its rounds through the media, those answers finally came to light. It turns out that Olson was more than just an everyday government scientist. In World War II, Olson had worked at the top secret lab in Fort Detrick, Maryland. There, he was an expert in, quote, aerosolizing biological agents and munitions. And in other words, biological weapons. After the war, Olson was the lead scientist in a project that exposed animals to anthrax and another that sprayed bacteria over the entire San Francisco area to see how vulnerable the city was to a biological attack. Throughout his growing career working for the CIA, Olson would continue to develop means of spreading bioweapons, which, as a reminder, are considered a war crime, making much of his research completely illegal. But as Olson got more and more involved with the CIA, he started to witness things he couldn't get out of his head. He saw firsthand the way that the CIA used torture as a means to attempt mind control, and he even watched as his own creations were used to torture people to death. By 1953, it was clear that Olson was deeply disturbed by his work and no longer supported what he was a part of. In November of that year, Sidney Gottlieb himself invited Frank Olson to a retreat with several other scientists at a cabin on Deep Creek Lake. It wasn't unusual for Gottlieb to hold these types of retreats, but this time it would have deadly consequences for Frank Olson. During a post-meal drink on the second night of his stay, Olson was given a Cointreau by Lashbrook, only to learn later that his drink had been dosed with LSD as yet another random attempt at experimentation. And this seems to have been the final straw for Olson, and he tried to resign a few days later, but was eventually talked into staying. When it was suggested that Olson see a psychiatrist to talk about the stress of his job, he agreed, and Lashbrook then drove him to New York City. And days later, Olson was dead. It's easy to see why people have connected the dots that led to murder. Many believe that the CIA no longer saw Olson as a stable, reliable tool and removed him to prevent MK Ultra from being impacted. While we will likely never know for sure if Frank was murdered, we feel that at the very least the CIA was indirectly responsible for his violent death. The Olson case underscores yet again that the CIA were willing to do whatever it took to achieve the power of mind control, even if it meant endangering or murdering its own scientists. But now we get to the end of MK Ultra, and there's so much more we could talk about here, but I'm trying to kind of parse it down into what I believe may be beneficial. MK Ultra was a huge program, and we could spend hours diving into the details. But suffice to say, this episode gives a good primer into what the CIA was up to and the lines they were willing to cross. Their work on mind control would continue officially on paper until 1973, when the program was allegedly halted in the wake of the Watergate scandal, though obviously many believe that it continued after that and still continues to this day. By then, though, Frank Olson had been dead for 20 years, and Dr. Cameron for nearly 10. It would also be another 2 years before the public learned anything about MK Ultra, and even then they would only get scraps of information. That's because after MK Ultra ended, almost all of the files relating to the program were completely and thoroughly destroyed, meaning that they completely covered their tracks in an airtight method. They went room to room, building to building, office to office. Back then, obviously, everything was typed out and on paper. They didn't have computers like we have today. So every single file or piece of paper or document relating to MK Ultra was shredded, was burned, or was disposed of. And obviously, we still don't even know. There may have been more people involved in the secret program that were taken out, that were silenced. It's really unknown, and it's such a weird, murky, mysterious topic. I mean, the answer is I don't think we'll ever really have it. Knowing all this, though, it's really hard to look at the American government the way we did before. After all, some of the victims and their families are still alive, which kind of serves to remind us how close in time we really are to the MK Ultra program. Is it really so hard to believe that the government continues to conduct similar experiments? What other projects have occurred that we know nothing about? Have you or I ever been involved in something like this without our knowledge? As we often do, we're ending this episode with questions. But even with some things still unanswered, there's one absolute thing that I know and that you should know for sure. You should never trust the CIA. Well, folks, that is it for today's episode. Yeah, there's so much that we could go through with MK Ultra and the intricacies of the program and all these branches of MK Ultra that led into and bled into things like the Phoenix program in Vietnam and all these different top secret government programs. There are literally thousands of them that we could cover on this show, like Operation Gladio and Operation apparently Mockingbird, Blue Jay, so many programs. And you have to keep in mind with all these stories. This is what I was telling myself that's mind blowing. This is also just the stuff that they're allowing us to know. You know, there are not only thousands, there are probably tens of thousands of programs and experiments and things that the government did and is currently doing that we will never know about. At the end of those programs, the silence is guaranteed. People are killed, people die in mysterious ways, and the public is never made privy to the existence of these operations. So if you kill the one or two people involved in them and shred the paperwork, especially back then, the story dies forever. I'm sure that there was some extremely dark shit went on with MK Ultra. I mean, obviously it's already extremely dark, breaking people's minds down to control them and turn them into murderers and super soldiers. But yeah, it's really just the tip of the iceberg. And I kind of mentioned earlier in the episode, that's what a lot of people theorize that the government was experimenting with, especially in the 1980s, was also mind control. We've heard tons of survivors of that were what they believed were cults. They were all subjected to the same things. So if you look at these stories and you even go back on this channel and look at stories that I've covered in the past, you see a lot of the same things in a lot of these stories. You see the kids being forced to play games with these twisted adults. You see the usage of satanic occult iconography, robes, candles. You see them right in front of the kids. You see games with feces and being forced to eat your own excrement, like these kids, or play with their own excrement. You hear stories of music and just all these different cues that kids were allegedly subjected to, whether it's at the Presidio in San Francisco or at West Point, or at these daycares and just different affiliated places. A lot of people believe that those were secret programs that were implemented to also once again try to break down the minds of children. And so this is just an opinion. I also totally believe in that because oftentimes I get a lot of questions, and I've had a lot of people say to me that I'm trying to restart the satanic panic and blah blah blah, satanic blah blah. Not true at all. I don't believe that those things were done in the name of Satanism or anti-Christian sentiment. I personally believe, especially when you have a case like the one at the Presidio, I believe that a lot of these cases occurred in a sort of MK Ultra program, and then afterwards, all this was played up to the max, and then it gave birth to the satanic panic because people were taking it way too far. I mean, they were calling Dungeons and Dragons demonic and heavy metal music the music of Satan, and innocent people were indeed blamed for doing things that they didn't do. But I also believe that was engineered and really blown up through the media and government messaging, and it all plays into all of it because now anytime that you suggest that any one of those cases involving a satanic quote cult and the children happen, you're called a satanic panic person and you're doing this and that and that. But that's the perfect tool of the government, to create this shield so that you can't question or even take a look at these stories, which a lot of people are nowadays back at this stuff. And it's a select few cases, but it's the same for me with, like, let's say, or I believe that both of those, and I've talked about this before, were engineered disinformation campaigns. And I want to do a video on the actual origins of, for example. Now, there's some weird stuff surrounding the dude Alphonsus. There's no doubt about that in my mind. He had some really bizarre stuff, and there are some weird extenuating circumstances and things surrounding that. But if you look at the origins of, for example, you had a number of anonymous accounts on boards like 4chan within the same hour, 2 hours a day, all suddenly post different things about this story. Like they're almost seeding the story. And these accounts, there's no information on them. They were never active before. They were basically created and then used to just post this stuff, and then they disappeared. And to me, that screams disinformation. And why do I think they did that? I think they did that because they knew with social media and the news and the lawsuits that were piling up that the Epstein thing was going to become something very, very soon. So they were trying to plant those seeds in people's minds so that you're called crazy. You're called a conspiracy theorist. I remember even like 3 years ago, if you talked a lot about Epstein and his connections to, politicians and blackmail, you'd get comments like, Lever, blah blah blah. And it's exactly, to me, the same thing like the satanic panic, where you actually take a look at these narratives beyond sensationalism and beyond just exploiting the darker parts of these stories, and you really look at what may have happened, and you look at victim testimony, you look at corroborating evidence. That's when these narratives come forward that run completely in opposition to the official narratives in some of these stories, whether it be on Guest House or obviously things like the Mark the True scandal. And I mean, just some of these cases, like the Presidio case, we covered in depth. And according to the government, it's completely debunked and nobody ever went down for it. But some of the kids contracted the daycare, caught on fire in the middle of all that, destroyed any potential evidence. There were employees on the base, who saw weird men in robes running around, and they found a shack with a mannequin in it, and all this weird occult iconography scrambled inside of the building. And obviously, all the kids were telling their parents that these things were happening to them. Now, I don't know if you realize, but all those things stopped. They stopped happening. So to me, once again, that's another rabbit hole, because if kids were inclined to do those sorts of things, wouldn't you think like at least one of those things would happen in the modern era? Like kids would start telling you stories and make this stuff up, but it doesn't. and it hasn't happened in decades. That's in my opinion because these things were legitimate operations that were being done and people were being studied at the Presidio. For example, the guy really in charge of the Presidio, one of the main guys was Michael Aquino, affiliated with the Temple of Set, which is an offshoot of the Church of Satan, Anton LaVey. Hardcore Satanist, that's not up for debate, that's just a fact. And he was also the head of the psychological, I think it was psychological warfare department with I think it was the U.S. Army. It was one of those things, but he's literally a psychological, essentially, officer. He's a Satanist. And then at the same time, you have all these kids who have these satanic claims at parties, and the kids are able to accurately describe the interior of Aquino and his wife's home. And one of the kids points Aquino and his wife out on the street and says, "There's the people, that's him and that's her." And yeah, it's a mind blowing rabbit hole. But regardless, y'all, we'll be back next week with another brand new episode of the show. The next episode we're going to do is the Charles Manson MK Ultra connection, which is where the stuff really takes off and goes crazy. But as always, y'all, keep that tinfoil hat on, stay suspicious, question everything, and yeah, catch y'all next week.